Hello and welcome to this evening's Canary Live event. This is International Women's Day, and we just thought it would be really great to have a conversation about International Women's Day, the theme for this year, which is Choose to Challenge, and what that means for us as three women who work at the Canary. So yeah, just briefly to introduce myself, my name's Nancy Mendoza. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and one of the founders of the Canary. I identify as female, my pronouns are she and her, but my experience of gender is a very autistic one. And that's something we might talk about later, or we might not. We might save that for another time. Let me introduce you to my two wonderful colleagues who will tell you who they are themselves. Emma, do you want to go first?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Emma Guy. I identify as a female, and I am one of the investigative reporters at the Canary.
Afrose?
Hey, hi everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Afrose Zaidi. I am weekend editor at the Canary. I identify as a woman as well. My pronouns are she and her. And yes, my experience of it's been, I think my whole life is pretty much based on my experience as a brown Muslim woman, and has been very sort of colored by that.
Yeah. Thank you both. So, choose to challenge. That's the theme of International Women's Day. I guess there's lots of ways that we could interpret that phrase. But I thought maybe we could just talk a little bit about what that means to us, and maybe we can give some examples about, where we've done that or chosen not to. I mean, that's, it can be valid also. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's often been about actually catching not so much the kind of overt sexism that goes on around me, whether that's, work or family or in the pub or whatever. And it's more kind of about the kind of micro aggressions, as we call them, the more kind of subtle things that go on. I can see Emma smiling and nodding. I wonder whether that resonates with you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it's sometimes really hard to pick when you're going to call things out, and when it's completely easier for the functionality of life to just not say anything at all. And I think, yeah, definitely from my experiences, it has been a combination of the little things that have that lead to the much bigger, maybe more overt calling out.
So is that almost like the smaller things almost kind of are what make a culture that enables the bigger things, or are they unrelated? Maybe I've misunderstood that. What do you think?
I think so. I think the smaller things often are unnoticed. If you're sat in a room and someone is overtly, very obviously being misogynistic or sexist in any way, it's much easier for someone, well, perhaps not easier, but it's much sort of more direct to call that out in person, as you see it happening and developing. Whereas the smaller things, I think, tend to, especially in the workplace, go unnoticed.
Yeah, and I guess when we say smaller, we don't necessarily mean less impactful either. So some of the things I'm thinking of might be, when you're in a meeting and you realise that every time you've opened your mouth, a man has spoken over you. Like, I've definitely been in that meeting.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think that it's harder to some extent now that we live in sort of quite a digital workplace, because you have to often, in my experience, be in that room to get a word in edgeways, or to perhaps get that lead on a story, or the lead on a project. It's not just about journalism as well. And I think now it's so much easier to disregard women, and to not take a call if they ask for one, or not do a one-to-one if they ask for one.
Yeah.
And I think that I don't think there's been a time where it's been easier to disregard women in the workplace.
Because of the online nature of how we're working now.
Yeah.
Afros, how about you? What's your experience with these sort of, more subtle things versus more overt misogyny?
Where do I start? My most overt and probably one of my most traumatizing experiences in the workplace, certainly, was an interview that I gave for this position that was basically, I was on a fixed term contract at this place. And I had part of the redundancy what's it called, policy, was that they had a redeployment policy, that's what it's called. So basically I was, I would get priority for the jobs that I applied for, something along those lines. So I got to interview stage at this job, and there was this man who was on the interview panel. And he started grilling me about things that I later found out were actually not even part of the job role, like they didn't even feature. And I only found this out because I ended up working in that same office, but in a more junior role. So I got it at a lower level, lower grade. And he started basically implying that I was embellishing my experience and that I put things, or that I was trying to say things that I was capable of doing that I wasn't. Wow. And his tone was supremely condescending. So I said something about transferable skills, and he went, "So these transferable skills that you've mentioned." And I was just so uncomfortable in that interview. I've never felt so humiliated in my life, I think, in a professional context. And, I just came to a point where, I was just like, yeah, I suppose you're right. I don't have the experience that you're asking for. But the irony was that actually he was asking me about something that wasn't even
relevant.
Yeah, it wasn't even relevant. So this person wasn't directly in the office that I was working in, and that role was a part of. So when I started working in that same office, we had to, have dealings with this person. And, so there, pretty much everybody knew that he had done this, that I was in this interview, that he had spoken to me this way. And no one actually ever said anything about it. Nobody acknowledged that, that what he did was out of line, that he asked me about stuff that wasn't required in the role. So that's kind of, I think, maybe the most overt example.
That's really interesting, because on the initial experience with this guy, really undermining you, and that's what unconscious bias looks like also. It's people, a lot of people who behave that way won't necessarily be thinking to themselves, this stupid so-and-so whatever person sitting in front of me is that way because they're female, and I'm going to give them a really hard time because they're probably lying, because women wouldn't be capable of all that stuff anyway, blah. But I think with a lot of people, it really is quite unconscious. It is that just little sort of default setting in your mind that goes, oh, woman-shaped person, therefore not as capable, therefore not as experienced, therefore probably lying, like that. But that also, it seems, was something that was enabled by the culture of that organization.
Yeah, very much. And I think also one thing that I did notice in that environment, because I interviewed for lots of different roles, over the course of several years, and eventually I left. But what I did notice is that people were more confident in the potential of men, and especially white men, to do things than they were in the actual experience of somebody like me. So even though I had done things and I had experience of things that, you know, other sort of other candidates didn't have. They literally trusted the potential of men who didn't have experience in those things more than they trusted my experience. So it really is very much, you know, biased, whether or not it's conscious or unconscious. I mean, I imagine it is unconscious because they would never actually admit to it, right? Yeah, but I mean, so while I was in that office and in the course of that, while I was in that role, there were two men who joined after me at a similar level, who then within a year went on to a higher grade. And I was in that role for like 4 or 5 years or something, and I was still stuck there. Like you know, interviewing and whatever, and I couldn't move up. So
it's
yeah,
sadly such a common experience. Like, you know, I don't say that to diminish in any way how awful that was and how traumatic and how utterly unfair. But yeah, it's all too common.
It is so common, and I think that I didn't realize how common it was until we started having conversations like this with the women that I trained with. And I spoke to quite a few of them today, and the more that we have these conversations and the more that we sort of call things out between each other and share those experiences, the more we're realizing that it does happen a lot, and it does actually strangely happen a lot in interviews. I was directly asked in an interview whether I had children and whether I was planning to have children anytime soon.
Wow, that's completely illegal, just to make that point.
Yeah. And I'm not the only person. There have been several other people who that's happened to as well. Yeah. Yes,
Again, a really, really familiar story. And what you're saying, Emma, about that kind of, you know, the conversation that is happening between women about this. And I just saw that a comment flash up on the screen from Cherry Menthol offering solidarity for International Women's Day. Thank you very much. Solidarity right back. There is power in that. There is power in numbers. There is power in solidarity. There is power in, you know, not pulling the ladder up when you've made it. There's power in really standing with someone who's having a hard time. And I think, you know, sometimes people maybe are nervous to speak up, you know, on someone's behalf, or, you know, for fear of seeming like they're patronizing or whatever. I think that's probably quite a personal thing and something to kind of have a conversation with your colleagues about. I think, you know, we have to have these conversations among us. But, you know, certainly from my point of view, I can think of one occasion where I was in a meeting and I was the only woman in the room, and I was in a meeting with 3 men who were all senior to me in the organisation. But in terms of what we were discussing, I was actually the expert in the room. And that's the only time I can think of where somebody was not listening to me, was talking across me, and was not understanding that I was there as an expert. And one of the other men actually stepped in and said, hang on a minute, I need to hear what Nancy's got to say about this, because she knows about this stuff and she's done this thing before. But that's, I can think of one occasion where that happened. It was quite a while ago, so the man in question was on the progressive side for sure, certainly in that organisation. But I don't mind that. I don't mind being in that situation where somebody notices and steps in like that, because apart from anything else, I'm so used to it that sometimes I don't even notice it's happening. How do you two feel about, you know, having a colleague, male or female or non-binary or whoever, kind of step in that way? Does that feel okay to you, or do you prefer to like be given a chance to kind of advocate for yourself?
I think that it's kind of ridiculous that we have to be in that position in the first place.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I mean, regardless of whether they're male, female, they identify as. I think that if someone is standing by my side and saying, actually, no, what Emma has to say is valid and you need to listen to it, I will always welcome that. I would personally never feel uncomfortable with someone stepping in and highlighting that what I had to say was important. Yeah, that's my experience. And I have had conversations with colleagues in the past where I've taken them aside and thanked them afterwards for doing that, because it's a very uncomfortable situation, especially, you know, I mean, in offices, but actually in Zoom as well, when communication is sort of stunted, and often people have bad connections and conversations don't flow naturally. So to call someone out over the phone in front of a video call with several people in it, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, it's always, actually, I would say, so there's a question on Facebook from Cherry Monthal, how do we make positive change? And I could probably sort of, you know, answer both in one go, in the sense that I would say that the onus is probably, you know, for tackling not just sexism in the workplace, but just sort of sexism and misogyny in general. It's on everyone. It's not just on women. It's not just on the people who experience misogyny, but it's on everyone. And in that sense, I do think that it's, you know, very welcome when someone actually does intervene and, you know, notices and calls it out. You know, for me personally, anyway, I'm the kind that I wouldn't even say anything, because I just can't, you know, I'm very careful with how I expend my energy. And I just, you know, I'm not really one to kind of fight to have my voice heard. So if I'm in a space where I feel like people don't want to listen, I will probably just not share. So I do think that it's quite welcome in that sense. Somebody does step in and say, actually, we should hear from a pros, or, you know, and I think, I mean, I would hope that if I saw it happening, that I would do the same thing, that if I saw somebody being kind of, you know, not listened to in that way, particularly if they're from a marginalized background, that I did the same for them.
You make a really good point there about energy expenditure, Afroz, I think. This is something I think we're perhaps talking about a bit more in relation to racism at the moment, and with the strides that have been made with Black Lives Matter movement for the last couple of years. I think this is more forefront in people's minds, where, you know, actually the emotional energy it takes to keep on doing this, to keep on having these same conversations, to keep on advocating for ourselves, to keep on educating people on, you know, our experiences, our lived experiences, is really important. And it's, you know, it's one of the reasons, you know, as a white person, I consider it, you know, my responsibility to call out, you know, white supremacy where I see it, because, you know, my black and brown siblings are knackered. You know, they've all had a lifetime of this, and I'm only really just learning how to do that properly, how to really be an ally. And the same goes for issues around gender, and particularly for women. It's like, you know, all we want is people to be allies. It's as simple as that. Learn to be a great ally. That's how we make positive change. And that's, I think, again, I think the conversation that we're having now is different. And I am so glad about it, because, you know, for me, kind of growing up, I kind of came of age in the 1990s. And in the 1990s, there was this whole like political correctness movement, which is not dissimilar from what we talk about now as being woke, right? These things tend to come around again. But the response to that at that time, and, you know, the late 90s, early 2000s, that kind of Labour government that we had, that Labour government put through more legislation, I think, than any other in history. And their answer to a lot of these things was to legislate, was to put in policy, was to, you know, say, and to talk in terms of like representation, meaning numbers. you know, lots of people say, oh, it would be so much better for women in this workplace, in Parliament, in school, you know, whatever, if there were only more women. And that was something that was kind of, you know, legislated about and made policies about. And the solutions to these problems were, you know, put crashes in universities and, you know, all of these things, which are great and they benefit everybody, not just women. But nobody was saying, what is the experience like? What is it actually like being a woman in this context? And I feel like we're finally at the point where that's the conversation we're having. And, you know, it's little and early and we need to keep building on it. I've just seen a comment coming in. Can you challenge the status quo which says men are women if they identify as such and women are hateful bigots when they refuse? I think Canary does a great job of representing working class leftists, and this ideology is dripping in academic jargon and elitism. Also, lesbians have been abused mercilessly for years, as are increasing numbers of gay men. Please show your solidarity by opening up much needed discussions. Absolutely. I think in the scope of this particular event, if we go too far down the kind of intersectionality rabbit hole, we will probably miss some of the really important points that we want to cover today about International Women's Day. But you know, you're looking at you know, three people with intersecting identities already. So when I talk about my experiences as a woman, I talk about that from the perspective of a gay woman who's disabled, who's autistic, who's Jewish. And how all of those things interact, same for the other two with their own identities. So I don't agree with the statement that there's a status quo which says men are women if they identify as such. Women are women if they identify as women. And I believe that and I accept that regardless of their chromosomes or their hormones or their body shape or their genitals or anything. You know, I accept trans women are women, and it's not something I'm actually willing to debate.
No.
Which sounds like I'm being an arse in a way, but I'm really not. It's like I don't debate someone's right to exist in their own identity. I just don't.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that it, you know, if you say that you're a woman, that who are we to debate that? That's not up for debate. If you say you're a woman, you're a woman.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, you know, we don't have any trans women on the panel, so I don't really think it's right to actually even go there really with the discussion. But yeah, I think it's pretty much not. It's. I think we can all agree that it's not really something that is up for debate. But even more so when we don't have representation on the panel, so we can't really speak on behalf of a group that isn't represented.
Absolutely.
What we can do is show solidarity, because obviously we know the levels of violence against trans people. We know the amount of transphobia that's been going on in mainstream media in this country. You know, so I think that we can absolutely show solidarity, and it's, you know, since it's International Women's Day, we can absolutely show solidarity to trans women.
Trans women are included in. When I say women, trans women are included. That's just it. I mean, in terms of, you know, the kind of the conversation about no, bear with me. Sorry, I have a very slow brain, and sometimes I take a moment. So I think the only one other thing I want to say about the kind of issues around people who are trans is that actually some of the most interesting, informative, illuminating conversations I've had about gender have been with people who have transitioned, because they are often, not always, but they are often in quite unusual position of having moved through the world being assumed to be one gender, and then moved through the world being assumed to be a different gender. And I think the perspective that that gives is tremendously interesting, and particularly from trans women, actually, who have that experience of, you know, having moved through the world with people assuming that they were male and relating to them that way, and then not only being a woman but also being a trans woman, you know, actually finding that life feels very, very different, and you're listened to in a different way, and your opportunities are different. So yeah, trans women included.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the wording here as well, that this ideology is dripping in academic jargon and elitism, and I just think that to call it an ideology is not really accurate anyway, and to then say that it's dripping in academic jargon or elitism, it's not actually like, you know, the amount of trans people that have gone into financial difficulty because of coming out as trans. It's really nothing to do with elitism at all. And actually, if we were truly working class, we would be inclusive enough to also support the rights of trans people. And I mean, I remember once actually somebody speaking, I don't want to say where, but basically effectively against transgender people. And this person was some kind of psychologist, child psychologist or something, like by profession, right? And she actually claimed that these people need therapy. Trans people need therapy. And I just thought, like, do you know of trans people who've had therapy and then felt better afterwards, like felt that they weren't trans anymore? Like, where is this even coming from? So, you know, I just feel like it's really damaging for people who haven't had that experience to then say things like they need therapy or this is elitism or it's academic jargon when you haven't had that experience.
Yeah.
So you can't label it that way, right? This is somebody's lived experience. So if you aren't going to listen to that person, the least you can do is not speak on their behalf.
Right.
I think that's it, isn't it? It's about listening. And I think, Nancy, I know you mentioned about sort of being politically correct and things like that. And I think that we can challenge each other just by listening and by having conversations, and perhaps, you know, we are all human. We will all say things at a certain point in our lives that perhaps aren't the right things to say. But I think we need to challenge that and start conversations in that context by asking people about what they feel comfortable with and what their pronouns are. And, you know, start meetings that way just to make sure that everyone is comfortable and that you are being inclusive.
Yeah. I mean, all of what we're speaking about this evening really is the kind of how to be a good ally 101. And it applies right across the board to all oppressed and marginalised people. But going back to the theme, choose to challenge, you know, this goes for cis women, trans women, all kind of female identified people. It can feel really scary and really daunting, particularly as a woman, perhaps in an organisation that has the kind of culture that Afroz described earlier and that Emma and I have both experienced. What advice would you give to someone who is really, like, they really want to make a change, they really want to make a difference in their organisation, they see these things happening, but like literally, who do they talk to? What do they do? Like, how do they get over the fear? How do they assess whether it's safe even to do the calling out? Like, what would you have any advice on any of that? I think my advice would be like to just start with someone you trust.
100%. Yeah, whether they're at the organisation or not, talk to someone that you trust and that you do feel safe to have that conversation with. My biggest piece of advice would be, if you do not feel safe to call out an incident or a situation at an organisation, that probably is not the organisation that you want to be a part of. And I would definitely urge everyone to to sort of seek and to sort of create the environment that they want to work in, because you have to work in it every day. And that's something that I've definitely found here. I've definitely found that here I am seen as Emma, as an individual, and my views and my work are sort of judged by that. So definitely seek an environment that you feel safe in.
Yeah. I think also, just building on that, there's obviously, employment is not something that can be taken lightly, especially during a pandemic, right? And everybody's been losing their jobs. But I think especially for somebody like me, where the way that I've struggled in actually finding work, and it's much harder when you are vocal politically. And it's much harder when you are expressing views that go against the status quo. So it's all right. People are all for diversity and representation when those people, when the women or, the people of color that come forward are upholding the status quo, right? When it's somebody who's challenging it, when it's somebody who has politics that are in any way radical or even, in any way kind of disruptive of what the norms are, that person immediately becomes unwelcome. That's definitely.
Do you think that's different for men and women? I get the sense maybe it is.
It's more, it's definitely more so for women. So I said at one point that if you're a woman who, expresses her opinions loudly, you get sidelined and ignored and written off as hysterical or whatever. And if you're a man, you become George Galloway.
Right.
So it's absolutely different for women than it is for men, and more so, I think, for women of color. So I think that in that context, we always have to preserve ourselves, our mental health, and our family priorities. And if you need a job, and if calling that whatever situation out is going to jeopardize that, then I would say absolutely put yourself first, because no one else is going to do that. So I think that it has to be very carefully managed. I think the burden of, change is not something that you can bear all of the time. And I think that it's really, and I've particularly come to realize this over the past few months, because of disability, because of illness, because of trauma and all of these things, I've realized that actually creating change is a privilege. It's not the kind of thing that that anyone can just do.
I really agree with that.
Be fit and well, you have to have the time and the resources, and the platform and the position and the influence and all of those things to be able to do it.
Absolutely.
And to feel that at any point it's not worth the cost to you, then I would say don't do it.
After yourself.
And look after yourself.
Yeah. No, I really I'm really aligned with that. I think, this is why allyship and solidarity is so important, as we said, but it's also why recognizing your own privilege is important. Because I'd almost go a step on from what you said and say, if you have those privileges and you care about equity, then perhaps there's some responsibility that you bear.
Yeah,
absolutely.
To be the things you want to see.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. I think that checking in with each other is one of the most important things that you need to prioritize. I mean, I've had conversations in people's cars, in car parks, outside of offices, and you know, or sort of Zoom calls and lunch breaks when it's the only opportunity you can to have that conversation. And I just think when I said earlier about to sort of seek a safe environment, if that workplace isn't the safe environment, then find an environment within that. So find a safe space with yourself and a colleague, if possible, and to have those conversations if you feel safe. But also, it's about people might not say anything, and it's about reading your colleagues as well, to make sure that if someone isn't perhaps acting the way they usually would, you know, something might not be okay. And it won't harm at all to just check in and ask them how their day is and to have that conversation.
It's really, I think it's what's really clearly coming out of this is the kind of strength in numbers, I suppose. The kind of, you know, it's a big conversation that has to happen, but that conversation can start really small. That conversation, you know, sometimes for me, it's been about actually checking my experience, because I think I've been so kind of thoroughly gaslit in some situations that I don't even, I'm like, did that just happen? It's happened to me less around gender, but I certainly, when I first started dating Carrie-Anne, who's brown and has mixed heritage, that was probably the first time that I kind of was really conscious of having those did that just happen kind of moments. Like, you know, we go out for a nice meal in a restaurant and they'd always hand me the bill, despite the fact that Carrie-Anne was earning 3 times more than I was at the time. You know, it's these assumptions and things that where I'm just like, did that happen? Do I want to get upset about that? Do I really want to deal with that? As well as the gaslighting, it's like, oh, you know, again. And that's why we need to support each other. We need to really, you know, validate each other's experiences. If somebody's like, I feel kind of uncomfortable about this, but I'm not sure, can I, you know, talk through with you what happened and just check that? That can be incredibly powerful. So I think, you know, Choose to Challenge requires a community effort as well as an individual effort, and it involves us enrolling other people in this movement for change. Now, going back to what you were saying about privilege, I mean, obviously, I was in a very privileged position of being able to say, right, me and some other people, we're going to start this media organisation, and we're going to be in charge, so we can create whatever culture we want. And that's, you know, and that was such a high priority for us and such a serious responsibility. And I want to see other people doing that. I want to see the people who are leaders in their organizations be the first ones to stick their necks out on this stuff. So as well as the community, as well as the solidarity, you know, amongst women, I want to see those people in leaderships, whatever their gender, being the ones to say, right, now stop, enough. This is not how we behave here.
Yeah.
And doing that by actually being that way.
Yeah, that's a great example, actually. So really, you know, how you can use your privilege then to create that change, and, you know, acknowledging it for a start, acknowledging that actually you do have that power, you do have, you know, things at your disposal where you can, you can actually make a difference, and then taking some responsibility with it. Yeah.
So I hope that helps, you know, people who are kind of sitting there thinking, well, I know this stuff is happening, I want to take some action, but what do I do? And, you know, might be feeling scared and nervous about it, which is completely reasonable and completely understandable. I want to kind of pivot slightly at this point, because I think one of the reasons that, you know, we're sometimes nervous about calling things out is that people can be quite defensive when you call them out. So I think I think there's two sides to this that I want to kind of address now. I think one is like, how can people get better at being called out, which I think is also an important part, and where privilege comes into play as well. But also, like, I do want to address, particularly because, you know, we kind of live a lot of our lives online, and our work is online. This kind of cancel culture thing. Cancel culture. I sound old. I'm not a millennial, so I feel like I'm you know, using words I shouldn't. But you know, I watch YouTube. I know about Shane Dawson and Jeffree Star and people like that. Not because I watch them, but because I watch videos about cancel culture, basically, because I'm really interested in this, not least because it's something we experience as an organisation, and certainly Carrie Ann in particular experiences as an individual. You know, it's that I paraphrase Bonnie Greer, who I heard speak at an event a few years back, who said something along the lines of, they know you don't belong here and they're really scared they might like what you're saying. And another version of that is, I don't like what you're saying. How can I give myself permission to cancel you? Does that make sense? I'm kind of, you know, pulling words out of my head as usual. But I think there's a difference for me between cancel culture, between saying somebody did a bad thing, right? And we don't need to argue over whether or not some of the things that have been done by certain people online were racist, were homophobic or transphobic or, you know, Islamophobic or whatever. We know it happens. But the immediate then pile on Twitter or on YouTube particularly, Instagram as well, I think, to an extent, but again, I'm old, so I don't really understand Instagram. But there's a difference for me between that and holding people accountable.
Yeah.
So, what, like, I mean, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think about cancel culture? I'm just giving you my opinion. Maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pylon thing is quite interesting because the way that I see it, if someone does something wrong, really what you need to be, I mean, you know, everyone makes mistakes, right? Everyone can make mistakes and no one's perfect. But I think what we need to be judging them on is that once they've been called out, how they respond to it.
Exactly.
And how they make amends, with whether they take responsibility. And I think that's the real thing that, and I think where people maybe go wrong, I suppose, is they don't actually take into account the response. So even when someone has retracted, even when someone has said, yes, I admit I was wrong, I apologize, you know, people will carry on with the pylon. And then it's just kind of, and then somehow becomes like I don't know if it's fake news or like what the term is, but basically because so many people keep saying it people, you know, more people start to believe that actually, yes, they haven't made amends, or yes, they still you know, believe these things, or, you know, they never apologized, or so it kind of then never dies. So, you know, you just sort of have to.
It takes on a life of its own.
Yeah, it takes on a life of its own. So I think maybe that is the issue, is the fact that people don't really take into account that, yes, you can say something wrong, but also you can take responsibility and apologize and whatever. And then at that point, the pylon should stop, right? At that point, people should say, oh, okay, yeah, fair enough. This person realizes, has seen the error of their ways, and has accepted wrongdoing. So, you know, lesson learned. Great. And that shows, you know, it shows like growth and you know, that this person is open-minded enough to learning. But clearly that's not how it works on Twitter.
No, no, not at all.
which is unfortunate. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, and I think it's interesting when people don't take accountability and responsibility for it, or when people try and almost counter counsel. So especially recently, we've seen a lot of instances where people have piled on Twitter because politicians or whoever it may be from organisations have published journalists' emails or requests and things like that, and have almost kind of tried to flip the narrative before anything's been said or before anything comes out in the news, which is really interesting. And I think that it's happening more. I think it's kind of my issue with cancel culture is that it was sort of really sort of celeb and sort of sensationalized. And I think now we're seeing it applied more to journalists, which is interesting, but also slightly makes logging into the newsroom slightly terrifying at times, because you come to work and you have the full intention of doing your job, and you log off at the end of the day and can log on to Twitter and get called a bitch who doesn't know anything, and all you've done is like your normal 9 to 5. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what our phrase is described as, we give people a chance to be contrite and to learn and to change, is a really important one. And back to thinking about how do you deal with the response of the person that you're calling out. That's kind of the best case scenario, isn't it? Is that someone, we've had an example with one of our colleagues at the Canary who, I won't name names or say the subject because I don't want to rehash it, but somebody who we work with said something online some years ago before they worked with us. It was not a very nice opinion to hold. And then they changed their mind because they went away and they learnt some more and they grew. And not only did they change their mind, but they took on fighting against the sort of opinions that they had previously held. And that is exactly what I want to see. That is why the Canary exists. The Canary doesn't exist just to talk to people who already agree with us. Inevitably that's going to be a large portion of our audience. And I'm not naive to think that, people are just coming to us because they think they want to be educated. Of course they're not. But, we would never have entered into this if we didn't think that it was possible for people to change.
Yeah. And I think that's what it's about. It's about holding people to account, but also as journalists and colleagues holding each other to account as well. And having a newsroom where writers do challenge each other every day, and we do have debates and opinions, and we pitch in with each other's, with whatever we're working on. And it's that kind of like inclusive newsroom that I think is so rare within the industry, and it's something that we really need to promote and cultivate together.
Yeah, I agree. And it's about more than just having some women in the newsroom. In my opinion, I got very sick of hearing people say, well, if only there were more women, then it would be better for women, wouldn't it? It's like, no, that isn't how it works, because if you have lots of women, but they all are, happily subscribing to a misogynistic culture, then you've got a misogynistic culture. It doesn't. Women can be misogynists too. #. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for people who want to make change, I think, you've got to use your privilege. You've got to be prepared to call someone out and hold the space for them to have their reaction. And listen for them being curious and wanting to change. And, you know, most people get there. Like, most people are not assholes.
Yeah, I think most of the time people that are engaging in good faith, you can sort of get there with them. Unfortunately, where cancel culture should work and doesn't is with a lot of people who are not working in good faith. So,
Right.
all these comedians that go on tours after being canceled and complain about being canceled, for instance, because of their racist, whatever else, transphobic views and so on. So yeah, I think that definitely it's as long as you're engaging in good faith, you should be open to the possibility that people will change their mind and see, and recognize where they've gone wrong and accept that.
I think what I'd like to see is the same people who call out people online, or who support one another online as feminists, and in calling people out or holding people to account. I would love to see that sort of implemented in everyday life. So I would love to see that in meetings and in not just in newsrooms, but across like workplaces. Because I think if we could feel safe enough and comfortable enough to do that in a similar way, I think that work environments would be completely different.
I'll put you both on the spot here, because obviously, I was involved with starting the Canary from day one, and I know what I wanted to achieve with the culture and what we as a group wanted to achieve. Emma, particularly, you've talked about it, being quite a different environment than you've been in the past, and Afrez, you described a really horrific workplace, and I hope we're nothing like that. What would you say is the one thing that's made the biggest difference to you as a woman about the Canary as a workplace?
Afrez, do you want to go?
I'm just thinking, I think mostly it's, I think obviously it's not like I would say in any workplace, you still do have kind of, obviously, because you're still working within a society that's full of all kinds of people. And in any workplace, you will have sort of some issues or other, but I think the key is how they're addressed. And I think I've always, the difference that I've seen is that I've always felt able to raise them. Right. So normally I would either just not say anything, or I would be gaslit into believing that actually what I felt wasn't valid, or that I was seeing things the wrong way, or that I was taking things the wrong way, or that kind of thing. So I think that the main difference is being able to raise any concerns, and knowing that they will be heard. I think that's probably the biggest kind of
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, it was that I knew, not even from day one, probably when I did my interview, I knew that I would be accepted completely. And that was made really clear to me by Carrie-Anne and Emily, that, they were interested in getting to know me and my work. And that was really quite simply it, which made me feel, safe and comfortable to be able to not only do that interview, but then come onto the team. And I think with what's interesting with investigations is that it's slightly different. It's almost like a bubble. So I found that, I've been in lots of different workplaces and had lots of different experiences, but I think within the wider industry, there is a lot of misogyny. Whereas I think with investigations, because it's so direct and so kind of to the point, I think there's kind of a bubble where people look at the work first, and that comes through first. And it almost, I think for investigations, there are so few of us in the wider industry that work in that little bubble, that it almost has kind of created a sort of subsection of safety for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, I mean, obviously I'm delighted to hear, both those perspectives. And as Afro says, we don't always get it right first time. We often don't get it right first time. But, the thing that's always been really important to me was to create a space where, what Afro's described happens, where if somebody's struggling with something, or something's not working, or there's been an interaction between two people that just was a disaster, and someone's left feeling that they've been discriminated against, or the environment is not great for them in one way or another, that we do hear that, and not only hear it, but take action. And I think that's key. I think certainly a lot of the workplaces I've been in, there's been a lot of talk, and
not a lot of action.
And not a lot of action. If somebody comes to me and says, "Look, the language that we use when we talk about XYZ topic is something that really doesn't work for me. I find it triggering because I've had trauma in my past, or the community I belong to really doesn't like that language. Can we change that?" That would just be one example. It's like, well, yeah, like it's not even, I just don't consider that a conversation. It's just so obvious that, you say, okay, we're going to learn from this. I'm not someone who's experienced that particular trauma. I'm not someone who's part of that community. So when someone comes to me and says, coming from my experience, this is what works for me and this is what doesn't, then why wouldn't I say, okay, let's have a conversation about how we talk about these things.
I think that's really interesting as well, because I think as journalists we experience so much online, that I think it's really important that the Canary, for instance, have created that environment of sort of acceptance and sort of safety, where people, there aren't sort of, it's not a case of bringing up issues, it's a case of just telling people what you feel comfortable with, to kind of make it easier for us to be able to do our jobs, to then sort of deal with the rest of the stuff that we deal with throughout the day.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I was going to sum up the answer to the question, how do we make positive change, based on our conversation today, I think I would say listening, and like really quality listening, not just words going in one ear and out the other, but really listening, really getting someone else's experience, and really closely hand in hand in that is curiosity. To know that you don't know someone else's experience, you can't speak for them, you cannot represent them. I'm not going to implement a load of stuff in an organization for the benefit of people of color without having some conversations with the people of color in the organization, because I don't know, I'm not a person of color. So I'd say sort of listening and curiosity hand in hand, very, very closely. I'd say small changes safely when you can is the starting point. I'd say use your privilege to be a good ally. And I think probably
Can I throw one in?
Do.
I would just say be kind to yourself and check in with yourself that you feel that the environment that you're in, you feel comfortable and safe, and that the environment that you're working in is one that others could feel comfortable and safe in. So be kind and check in.
And I think that the final one I was thinking of was solidarity, was actually looking around yourself and, you know, recognizing what you have in common with other people versus what's different. And just, you know, I think it's just so easy to try and kind of toe a party line, if you like, because that's what everybody does. And it's possible, I think, to stand shoulder to shoulder with people in a very quiet, gentle way, actually, to kind of, yeah, to drive that change from that shoulder to shoulder position. Yeah, that's kind of, yeah. Afrose, did you kind of draw anything else out of the
Yeah, no, that sums it up quite well. I would maybe add not being afraid to ask for help, building and relying on community, you know, building friendships, so that you're not at any point doing it alone. Because you know, what I've learned is that there are amazing people who are, you know, so willing and so open to support and to help and to offer, you know, love and kindness. And you just have to reach out and actually make those connections. So I would say, you know, don't make yourself an island. Definitely reach out to that community and rely on it as much as you can.
Awesome. So a very long answer to a question: how do we make positive change? I hope that this conversation between the three of us, talking about some of our experiences and some of the ways in which we see change as possible, has been useful and interesting, and, you know, is merely the start of this conversation, which will be ongoing and will, I hope, be a movement that grows exponentially. From today, International Women's Day, 8th of March 2021. This is where we started, and, you know, let's make every day Women's Day. Thank you both so much for joining me for this fabulous conversation. It's been really super interesting, and yeah, I love working with you both, fabulous women. And all the rest of my colleagues, we really do. We have a great time as well as we deal with some really difficult stuff. So, yeah.
We do.
All right. Well, and to those watching at home or wherever you are, thank you again for choosing to join us. We know you could have chosen all sorts of things to do between 7 and 8 on a Monday evening, and we're really honoured and grateful that you chose to come and be with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.